Welcome everyone to our xTalk, leveraging virtual crisis simulation and games to deepen learning and digital bridge divides. My name is Aaron Kessler. I am the Assistant Director for Learning Sciences and Teaching and the Residential Education team of Open Learning. Along with my team member, Jovi Nazareno, it is my pleasure to welcome our speakers today, Benjamin Harris and Suzanne Freeman. Ben and Suzanne are both PhD candidates in political science and will share their insights about their experiences with design and impact of using virtual crisis simulation, specifically war games, as part of the course instruction. They're going to discuss the outcomes of their study, crossing a virtual divide, wargaming as a remote teaching tool, and their continuing work to sort of implement these games in different settings past the initial study. A couple of reminders to start. Today's session is going to be recorded, so if you don't want to be part of the recording, stay to the back. Thank you. Ben and Suzanne will spend a little bit of time presenting their work, and we'll follow that up with a question and answer session for everyone in the room. At the conclusion of today's sessions, if you want to stick around and chat with our colleagues from Residential Education who are in the room, please do. We're happy to answer any questions people may have around Canvas, Lightboard Studio, and how maybe even to consider some of the outcomes of today's talk in your work. Without further ado, I welcome to the stage Ben and Suzanne. Suzanne?
Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. I think Ben and I are very excited to talk with you about this project. So our plan of the talk is that we're first going to talk about sort of the pedagogical challenge that we faced. What is wargaming? Sort of why we chose wargaming as our teaching tool. Explain who our students were a little bit. Explain the learning objectives of our game. Talk about how we actually designed the game so that if you wanted to design a similar game, you would have somewhere to start. And then how those learning objectives were fulfilled. So first, we faced three different pedagogical challenges. First, the question of we were designing this game when we were still all online during the pandemic, and it was how should we approach teaching in sort of this abnormal time, and how best. We had two different groups of students, some civilian students and some military students, and the question was how can instructors bring these two disparate groups together, and how can instructors get students excited about class again when everybody was so fatigued from being on Zoom? So what is wargaming? First, this is a definition from Peter Perla that I think encapsulates what wargaming is very well, which is wargames are a model involving people making decisions in a synthetic environment of competition or conflict in which they see the effects of their decisions on the environment and then get to react to those changes. And those three bolded portions are crucial, which is that it's people doing this, they're facing some kind of problem, and they have to make some kind of decision to address that problem, and they have to deal with the consequences of their decisions. And so there are three different types of games that we often talk about in this space. First, there are analytical games, which people might use to reach some kind of generalizable finding. So this is this has been used by militaries historically to create new military doctrine, explore those new ideas, think about what they're looking for in their future doctrine. There are also experimental games, which we see often used in political science now, which look a little bit more like randomized experiments, where there's a treatment on a group that's playing the game, and you're looking for some kind of experimental finding. And then there's the type of game that we chose, which is a pedagogical game, a teaching game, meaning that it's designed to teach and not to produce generalizable findings or policy conclusions. And we believe, and many other people in the literature believe as well, that teaching games are able to harness active learning, which is an incredibly useful tool for students, especially on Zoom. And so this is one of the reasons that we primarily selected wargaming. So because of its active learning benefits. And specifically, wargaming is great for active learning because it's creating this immersive environment where students have to think about this conflict and are often assigned roles where they're going to sort of really be part of this conflict, able to imagine themselves. They're going to critically engage with these issues. They have the ability to explore a complex decision space beyond just writing a paper or talking about it, but by actually trying to feel it. And there's the potential to consider hypothetical scenarios that haven't occurred. So you can look at more than just past history. And so how did we actually end up choosing wargaming? Sort of thinking a little bit about, that sounds great in practice. But the way that this kind of works is that we were sort of trying to figure out how could we get people excited in the pandemic again, thinking about sort of the wargaming working group that Ben and I had at MIT, and realizing that we needed to think of some kind of entirely virtual group that we could do for the students. And we ended up getting a lot of help from our faculty advisors in designing this game, sort of definitely a group effort. So who are the players that we were actually talking about? So the first group of players were 26 military mid-career officers at the Naval Postgraduate School and military fellows at MIT. So these are people who are in the middle of their careers in the military, and the majority of people were taking a class at the Naval Postgraduate School that was on East Asian security. And so that there are teaching objectives that come from that course. The second group of students, the civilian students that we were bringing together, were 9 civilian PhD students, so non-military associated, and postdoctoral fellows at MIT. And many of the students from the civilian group were enrolled in a course about wargaming design. So sort of 2 different groups of students with 2 different goals for learning. And so given those types of students, we wanted to pick our learning objectives to meet both groups. So for our first learning objective was that we wanted to deepen players' understanding of international relations concepts, specifically concepts about credibility, building alliances, and crisis management, and specifically about the relations between the People's Republic of China and the US and Taiwan, because those are some of the learning objectives from the NPS course. But given that we had 2 different groups of students, we also wanted, our second learning objective was bridging the divide between these 2 groups. And given that the MIT students were involved in a wargaming design course, we wanted to introduce them to this type of teaching tools and active learning experience. And so in a pedagogical game, all of the decisions that we make in the game flow from these teaching objectives, that everything is in service to these objectives. And this is how we did that.
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. So as Suzanne said, one thing that we believed really strongly is that every aspect of our game design needs to flow from our learning objectives. Because it's a learning game, that's ultimately why we're doing it. Everything has to be traced back to that. So the first thing we encountered was what type of scenario do we need to do? So we wanted to do a Taiwan crisis scenario in order to capture the East Asian political dynamics. But given that the majority of our players were military officers, almost assuredly all of them have played Taiwan war games before. Taiwan wargaming is like a whole niche industry. There are separate projects that Suzanne and I have worked on that have been super great, a lot of analytical games, and we wanted to do something a little bit different. So instead of doing a classic invasion scenario or something directly related to kinetic military operations, we chose instead to have a crisis scenario centered on a Fukushima-type earthquake that occurred on the island of Taiwan and that damaged the Kaohsiung nuclear plant near Taipei. This crisis scenario was very active. It required a lot of decisions by each of the major countries and players. It didn't necessarily require kinetic military operations, although there was always that risk. And importantly, a crisis like this allows us to ratchet up or down the pressure as the wargame controllers based on how our players are reacting. So as a bit of wargame terminology, the people who are controlling the wargame are called the white cell. And for the white cell, for an education game, one thing that's important is to make sure that we're changing the game in response to what the players need. So if the players are a little too timid, suddenly the nuclear crisis somehow gets worse. If things are going a little too quickly, we can slow it down as well. So this scenario created, as we said, strong time pressure. And then because of our other because of our other learning objectives, we divided up the 4 country teams, the United States, China, Japan, and Taiwan, into 2 sub-teams each. So for the 3 larger nation states, there was a civilian team and a military team. We populated those teams with a mix of actual civilians and actual military officers because we wanted the relevant civil-military divide in the game to be a design of the game, and we wanted to bridge the gap between the actual groups of real-life players. Because Taiwan had more limited military capabilities and because we wanted to capture the political dynamics on the island, we instead had a government team and an opposition team of the KMT. We had separate goals for each team in order to incentivize conflict and in order to capture some of the real-life dynamics that we'd see in such a crisis simulation. So a key thing that we had to do very directly was think about the communication principles for our game. In real-life wargaming, this is less of an issue. Most real-life wargames in the Beltway, you get your big group of experts, you're all in a room, you have a big map, you talk about things, there are rules about the game, but the communication framework is easy. You're in person, you're talking face-to-face, sometimes you'll divide into separate rooms, but a lot of it's like water cooler talk. But one of the original challenges we had is we're running this online. So the communication framework has to be built in advance, we can't rely on anything. And so for our principles, a guiding principle for us, based on current research and learning, is that we wanted to only use software tools that we knew all of our students were familiar with, from young grad students at MIT to mid-career officers. We debated using tools like Slack that would be really useful for certain things that we'd like because of functionality, and we were like, no, we're just using Zoom, we're just using Gmail, everyone knows how these things work. So every single team had their own Gmail account. Everyone was able to log into it before the game. They were able to send communications that way, and I'll get into the specifics on the next slide. And countries had their own Zoom rooms. Unfortunately, at this point in the pandemic, we were all deeply familiar with Zoom. Because we're creating the communication framework from scratch, we actually wanted to use this to our advantage. So for our wargame design, since we're testing things like our learning objectives center on bridging gaps and looking at civil-military divides, and because we're looking at alliance politics where communications in crisis are difficult, we wanted to use our digital framework to carefully control communications in a way that you actually can't in person. And so this was actually using the digital environment for a game as a benefit, not just as a drawback. And so with that, our specific communication framework, we had teams can communicate as a full country team at the beginning and end of turns. Turns are roughly 2 hours long. The game took place over 2 days, a Thursday and a Friday, in November in the middle of the semester. The teams were always allowed to send emails to the White Cell or communicate with White Cell by every single Zoom room had a White Cell representative in there that the teams could ask questions of and talk to. They could, most of the emails to White were requests for information, which is very familiar with anyone who does wargaming. No matter what you tell them, the players always want to know more about the situation. And then they were able to communicate with other teams only through White. And during terms, we limited them to meeting with other teams only twice per turn for a total, for each meeting 5 minutes. And so this meant if the US and China team wanted to hash something out, they had to be really direct in their communications. And it was really fun to see the players learn during the game. The first turn, most of the meetings were a lot of posturing, and then they came back to the rooms, they're like, wait a minute, we actually didn't talk about anything, we were just exchanging propaganda points. And it was fun to see them get like much more direct about their communication and much more purposeful about how they were doing things towards the end of the game. So a big question for any type of learning intervention or learning tool is knowing whether it actually worked. And we're instructors here, but we're also political scientists. So we're really curious about, hey, is this war game, is it doing all these great active learning things we wanted to do? Or is anyone actually getting anything out of it? And so we administered a pre and post-game survey asking questions on a variety of dimensions. And then we also did a couple follow-up interviews with a representative pool of people afterwards. Just at the outset, we don't really have demographic data on our players because the player pool is so small that any demographic information be really easy to identify any individual players, and we promised anonymity for a variety of ethical reasons. So for our first learning objective, again, we were trying to deepen understanding of major international relations themes, and we found just a lot of support for this. Between the pre and post-game survey, responses to the question, I have a good understanding of the political and military factors that would affect how a Taiwan crisis scenario unfold, increased by a statistically significant %. So, look, p-values lower than 0.05, done, easy, everything's fine for sure. But one thing that's very true when you use game or use a tool like this is almost by definition of a game, people are going to have a great experience. That's one of the reasons gaming is great for active learning. People are engaged, the actual experience of the game. People really got into it. People got into their roles. People got into the dynamics of it. People really cared who won or lost, even though we didn't define those terms, and even though it may not necessarily make sense in this crisis scenario. And that was great. So at the end of the day, it was unsurprising that the majority of our students were like, yes, this was amazing, right? But it's not clear how much, that doesn't necessarily mean they learned something. And so this is where the interviews were really helpful. A civilian player highlighted the importance of attention for alliance maintenance, talked about how fraught the alliance between the US and Japan got, especially with limited time for attention that both sides had. This quote is, I think, probably my favorite that we got from an interview, and it's from a military player. And this is a military player who is going to a posting in China. And this player said that, I think I would walk into any crisis with a lot less confidence than before this war game. and went on to describe that and saying, like, this was just so much more complicated than I thought this was. I hadn't considered how Taiwan's special status complicates pretty much any type of humanitarian relief effort, there's no way to have a crisis on Taiwan without this becoming a geopolitical crisis where there is a threat of military action. And it was really great to sort of see that realization of like, oh wow, there's a lot more here than I originally understood. So for our second learning objective, again, we're focusing on bridging the divide between civilian and military players. Throughout the game, players wanted way more communication between the civilian and military subteams, and this is actually something that we had to go back to our design and change during the game. And being able to change during a game is really important for an education game. Again, this isn't an analytic game. We're not trying to get generalizable findings here about what the scenario would look like. We're trying to have an experience that gets our students to learn things. And so we had to adjust that during the game. But it was really great to see the players really go into the civilian and military roles, not based on their real life affiliations, but based on the team they were on. Where the military team for the United States was like full of the military jargon and acronyms, even with our civilian PhD students. And it was just like really funny to see them adapting to those roles in the game and not in real life. Again, I won't go through all of it here. But we did have a lot of great backup with this from some of our open response and in our interviews. A lot of the military players talked about like how there was a divide in ranks. Specifically, a lot of the NPS officers were somewhat lower ranked than some of the mid-range officers at MIT. And they talked about how great the experience was. Like that didn't matter. Like they weren't necessarily aware of that, and they felt that they could operate across ranks without worrying about that. And so for our third learning objective, again, this is just, we're really trying to show that wargaming is an active learning experience, and especially for our PhD students who might use wargaming in their own instruction, we wanted to show its value. So we asked 3 questions between the pre and post game about whether wargames are a useful tool, can actually capture information, and then we also asked about whether in-person games are always superior to virtual games. Between the pre and post game, we saw movement on all of these and the directions that we'd like to see. Again, with the nice 95% confidence intervals. And so it's pretty clear that the experience of playing the game got people to believe more in the efficacy of gaming as a tool. And it was nice to see some of the people who were really skeptical before the game actually afterwards say, like, no, this was an amazing experience, and I feel like it was really valuable. Again, more quotations on that. One thing I want to highlight is that we didn't have direct measures of learning outcomes. So one way to think about that is like we didn't have a quiz afterwards where we had one class that played a war game, one class that just had a lecture, and then we had them take the same test and then measure their responses. And there are a couple reasons we didn't do this. One, we didn't have 2 classes to work with. That would have been great, but we did not. And then secondly, again, we're not the actual students' technical instructors. We were part of the War Game Working Group. We were working with the professors here. We built the game based on those learning objectives, but we did not want any part of our study to affect their grades. And so there was no way that we felt we could ask questions like that without students thinking that participation was mandatory and not voluntary, without thinking that somehow this might affect their class grade. And so we think this is a great direction for future studies, and something that I think, if eventually we're professors, we'd love to do in our own work, but certainly is a limitation that should be understood about this one. And then so Suzanne will go and talk a little bit about the experience and come through with our conclusions.
Yeah, so I think sort of after the game, reflecting back on what our experience with wargaming in the classroom was, I think what we had sort of 3 senses, which is first that the wargame was incredibly fast-paced. It required us to really be very focused on what we were doing, required all of the professor's attention for those 2 days, that it's a very intense event, that there's the need to be flexible on the instructor's behalf, that the game needs to be able to adjust to students' needs, that in the way that Ben talked about earlier, if it's moving too fast or it's moving too slow or students are becoming bored, you have to sort of see that as the instructor and make alterations to the game while it's being played. And that the other piece is that we really are also learning from the students, right? That they think of ideas and ways that they could deal with the crisis that we didn't even consider, right? Which then changes the way that you're going to respond. And that sort of this game had multiple moves. So in between each move, sort of the instructors in the white cell would decide sort of what happened based on the students' decisions. And we would sort of try to adjust what happened to try to continue on with the learning objectives rather than focusing on realism for the game because it's not looking to make generalizable policy outcomes. And so in conclusion, there are sort of a couple other things that we realized about wargaming in the classroom, which is first that virtual wargaming was actually a very useful tool for ameliorating some of the challenges that we faced online. That we were able to sort of bring an active learning tool to the classroom that wasn't just a discussion-based event. We were able to bring these disparate audiences together, audiences that were across the country from one another on the US East and West Coast, and that we believe this can continue to be a valuable tool even when in-person events are possible because it's so much lower cost. That had we needed to fly everybody out to San Diego or fly everybody from San Diego to Boston, this event would not have been possible. But since returning to in-person events, we've continued to run a game like this online every year because the virtual format makes it possible and because the virtual format has all of those positive communication benefits. But there are some trade-offs from the virtual environment which the instructor should think about. First, a virtual environment is likely to lose the quieter voices of your students, which is sort of common in a discussion environment. That one of the players that we spoke with was sort of talking about a student who's more introverted or more withdrawn may not be as active in the discussion as more outspoken players. And if we think about how Zoom works, only really one person can talk at a time. And so if one student is consistently taking initiative, it can make it more difficult to get sort of a quieter student into the discussion. Because it's on Zoom, ideally in a classroom environment, nobody's talking over each other. But on Zoom, it certainly cannot occur. And sort of continuing on this, that there's the possibility that some people are it's more difficult to interject on Zoom because you're not quite sure when somebody's done speaking. And so it takes there's an instructor in the room with with all the player teams watching their discussion. And so it's something for that instructor that's acting as a facilitator to think about to make sure that all of the students are becoming involved and sort of learning from the game. And finally, sort of in terms of our learning objectives about bridging this gap between those divides, we do think that there's an opportunity for games here to bridge gaps between different divides instead of just sort of the military and civilian piece. That there's sort of more research outside of international security that there's an opportunity to use gaming on. And finally, I want to turn it back over to Ben to talk a little bit about alternative options for gaming in the classroom to conclude.
Sure, yeah, so one thing that's been really, really cool about this is that we've been able to continue doing this game even when most classes aren't on Zoom anymore. So this past year, we just finished up our third annual collaboration game with NPS. This year, we also changed the scenario. Unfortunately, Suzanne and I did publish a paper on this, so we couldn't exactly use the same scenario again because it was out in the public domain. But we again used that as an opportunity. We solicited proposals from MIT grad students in our program to come up with a new scenario design to test things that they cared about in their research. So we had a different, really fun, still Taiwan-centered scenario. And when the two of us presented this at ISA this year, we had someone from the Naval War College come up and thinks that she wants to get her classroom involved in this next year. So hopefully this will be like a continuing opportunity for collaboration with people that we couldn't do if it were all in person. But also just for my own research, I TA'd last spring and then I'm TAing this spring. I love using games in the classroom because people actually care about them, and it's a lot better than looking to students as their eyes glaze over. And so I designed a Yucca Mountain game for knowledge assessment last year. Actually, tomorrow I'm playing a game with some of my students about trying to get around regulations that they themselves wrote for tech companies and misinformation to try and teach them how difficult it is to write regulations. So both of us really believe in gaming as a potential tool, not just for research, but also for learning. And we'd love to talk about that in the Q&A. So thank you so much for coming and for listening, and we'd be delighted to talk with you.
Thank you so much. Everybody give them a round of applause again. Thank you. This was amazing on so many levels. And I want to start by opening it up to the group who's here. I've got plenty of questions if people don't, but I want to make sure we give folks in the room a chance to ask some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So for our games, maybe it's best to start with the first turn the way it started. So we got everyone in a general Zoom room. We introduced the crisis scenario to them. We're like, hey, there's been this earthquake on Taiwan. Things are going wrong. It's really bad. Everyone had their roles. We then broke them to their team rooms, and we gave them specialized briefs for each of them team. Like the Taiwan team had more information on the ground. The US team had information from their long-range scanners. The Chinese team had more information about like specific subdynamics on the island. And we gave them their objectives, and we let them go. We did give them guides for what their move should look like. So the way a war game like this will work is it's turn-based, so they do things during the move, but at the end of it, they submit their move orders. And so what those looked like is they had military, diplomatic, economic, and then humanitarian disaster relief moves that they could do. So for the first turn, pretty much all teams spent those 2 hours scrambling, asking white for more information, trying to meet with other teams. The United States was trying to spearhead a relief effort on Taiwan. The PR said, no, we got this, everything has to go through us. There were competing international signals. And then the team's military and diplomatic moves afterwards sort of highlighted that. As my memory serves for this first turn, the PRC team was very, very aggressive in using the disaster to get military forces onto the island. They were actually aided by the Taiwanese KMT team, which controlled a couple key cities that opened for relief efforts. One thing that surprised me a lot, because we had a lot of military officers who worry about an invasion all the time, is the Taiwan team actually cared so much less about that and was so much more focused on like, oh my God, our civilians are dying. Like this is such, we just need anything. We don't really care about the larger geopolitical ramifications, which put the United States and Japan in a tight spot. And so they were actually much more reactive in the first move. They had a lot of if statements in their move orders. And so this was really fun. So the way we staged it is the first move was Thursday afternoon. And we did this because after moves, the white cell then has to meet to adjudicate, decide, okay, what move orders actually happened? How do we interpret move orders that conflicted with each other? And so we gave ourselves a long time because we knew the first move would be the most complicated. And so one thing that we really wanted to do is like, okay, like the PRC has shown a lot of initiative. We're going to reward them a lot with the adjudication. And then we're going to try and tweak the scenario to really put pressure on the US and Japanese players because like right now they're sort of sitting on the sidelines. And so we actually, like one of the things we did is we had a radiation plume get shifted by the wind and was going over Okinawa and a lot of southern Japan. And so suddenly the Japan team cared a lot more. And then the final two turns were on Friday. We had a much more abbreviated adjudication between turn 2 and turn 3. That lasted, I think, 45 minutes to an hour. That's when our actual players were eating lunch and the white cell was attempting to while adjudicating. And then we had the third turn, which is a little shorter, and then we had a very brief adjudication where we all met as a group at the end. It was like, hey, here's what the final move orders were, here's what we think would be happening, here's where it's going. It actually got to a pretty grim spot at the end because the PRC did have a significant number of soldiers on the island. Belatedly, the Taiwanese government was like, hey, we don't like this too much. The US military was poised to send assets into the room, and there were move orders given that seemed like actual shooting might have started, considering how commanders in the field might have interpreted their orders. So that's, sorry if that was too much of an answer to your question, but that's just like sort of how the game looked as it happened.
And I think the only thing that I would add to that is that the players have total freedom in their move orders to write what they want to do. There's not some pre-selected menu of choices for them, that they're coming up with their policy decisions, rather than being provided with a menu of options.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that, which is, I think it's important to sort of, you talked about your objectives for the game, but I want to circle back to, because I think it's a critical point with what you said here, in connecting this with objectives for the course in which they're in. So I think, what I'm hearing, I think, is that a lot of the sort of decision points that you're forcing them to confront are directly related to things that they're learning in the course and that they've talked about as part of this piece. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and I think the other piece about it is that this game generally happened in sort of November, once they'd already taken the majority of the course. Mm-hmm. So it really provided this opportunity to integrate many of the things that they'd learned about already, rather than happening at the beginning before they had a lot more knowledge.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a really great point, because the sort of idea is like, okay, you've learned about crisis management, you've learned about escalation dynamics, you've learned about alliance politics. Well, here's a sandbox where all of these things suddenly matter in a way that you actually get consequences for your actions. Yeah. So like a key part of the wargaming definitions, which Suzanne went over, is like wargames are loops where your decisions have repercussions, which then affect your next decision cycle. So it's a strategic environment in which students can get to play around with these concepts that they learn about in the classroom.
I have one more quick follow-up on that point, because you talked about the game and that was great. I'm curious about the feedback loop at the end, though, right? So you mentioned like did we win? Are we the winners?
Yeah.
Right? I'll ask it a slightly different way, which is, right? Like, yeah, which is, as instructors for the course and sort of this game, was there an opportunity to follow up with highlighting moves and pieces of impact so that there was an opportunity for the learners to reflect back on, oh yeah, maybe we should have written that order slightly differently and it would have resulted in, like, sort of, is there that post-game wrap-up with the learners as well?
Yeah, so I think Ben was talking very briefly about sort of that last open adjudication as a group. So that final session then rolls into what we call a player plenary, where the entire group spends about another hour on Zoom together talking about the course of the game, sort of what happened over the last couple of days. We go around to each of the player teams and ask them for their highlights. We ask them a couple of questions coming from the instructors. We talk about our thoughts. Students sort of go around again and talking about their thoughts. And so the idea is that plenary hopefully brings everything together. And so something that another player cell might have done or learned can hopefully be shown to a different player cell that wasn't with that student group.
Got it.
Yeah, a really great part of that hot wash too is like we had the teams go over the moves they didn't make, like the things they were thinking about. So it was really helpful for the full group to consider like, oh, this could have been a lot different. This is why it unfolded the way it did. We were also really lucky in that we had Admiral Scott Swift attend, who just like gave his overall thoughts having observed the game. We were considering having him as a player. We thought that might stretch the no uniforms, no ranks role. So instead he observed, and then he gave some like really insightful commentary at the end about like what do you think can be gleaned from the course of the game, and like specifically a lot for like the military officers, how this impacts how they think about their service, and for the civilian players, like how do you study crises like that. So we were really lucky to have someone that stature be able to observe and provide commentary on the game.
I think it also provided us with a final moment to sort of talk about this as a teaching game and not an analytical game.
Yeah.
That sort of reminding them, right, that we adjudicated things in certain ways to keep them moving towards the learning objectives. So sort of taking policy outcomes or expectations about how a crisis might go was not the goal of the game. That you sort of want to make sure that students aren't taking that piece away from them, with them.
Like they cared a lot about who won and lost,
Right.
and
But nobody wins or loses.
And, yeah, and part of the adjudication was like that doesn't matter,
Yeah.
and like the white cell certainly didn't, and we manipulated things in a very artificial way.
Right.
Right.
I think it depends a lot on the nature of the game. So let's say that there's a game in which you want to teach certain things, like certain principles. And I think this might be more appropriate for a younger audience or where you're more sure of the conclusions are. Well then, okay, you're playing the game and you want them to learn certain things, so you can play it multiple times and see like how they learn those things and then incorporate those principles. And like sort of in an abstract way, it's like a game theoretical game where there is an optimal solution or a certain path that you want the players to learn. In a game like this, there'd be value to playing it again, but it would be an entirely different game. And so I think the players would probably be better because they'd be more familiar with the rules and the structure of the game. Because all parts of using gaming as education is like part of it is learning the material and part of it is just learning the game. And that learning the game is like, yeah, if you play it again, you're not going to have to bother with that again. But because there aren't like definite conclusions that we're trying to get them to learn, like as Suzanne said, there's, I think, less of an importance in replaying it multiple times.
I think that's a really great point, and it's interesting how, you know, as educators broadly, we can think about how we might stack some of these experiences, right? So, for example, if you've got a 2-course sequence, maybe the first course is more focused on these sort of like gaining the experience of playing the game and certain pieces that we know we want them to take out of it, so that by the time they get to the next sequence, they're in this open space where they already know how to play the game. Maybe they can jump in a little bit faster, right? It depends on where our learners are at in the curve. I think it's a great reminder point, which is like, you've got experienced people in this group, right? These are all people who in some way, shape, or form, it sounds like, have experienced wargaming and that experience in some ways prior to coming to this. So I think that plays a role in the sort of where you can start versus where you have to scaffold maybe the early parts, and you know, what does it even mean to take a turn, right? Like, yeah, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think your inclination is correct that the majority of students here had played some kind of war game before. But I think when I talk with students that haven't done a war game before, a lot of students who are in international relations courses have often done things that are rather similar to war games without realizing it. So let's say that they were in Model United Nations in high school, or a debate club, or any sort of model Congress. All of those types of things where you have to make some kind of argument in a situation are pretty similar to wargaming. And so there are often sort of related experiences that they can draw on that doesn't require them to have played a wargame like this before. And I think at a very basic level, it requires the students to essentially understand that they have some role to play, decisions to make, and that they're part of a group. And the rest of sort of the rules of how will they talk to other players are often very different between war games. So that's something that players always have to learn. But I think the part that would be very difficult without an understanding of wargaming is for the white cell, for sort of the instructors, that I think that running a more complicated game like this would be very difficult for an instructor that didn't have any sort of concept of wargaming. But I think there are more simple games that can be played by instructors with less experience with wargaming, which then maybe could lead to a game like this.
Yeah, and I think just on the nomenclature point, like Suzanne and I both came through this like from the military analysis angle. Suzanne worked at the Naval War College. I worked at the RAND Corporation, and so for us, wargaming was the term. You could just as equally call it gaming without the war. You could call it crisis simulation, whatever you want. And I think to the larger point, like any instructor has to meet their students where they are for any type of instruction. And so like for the game, the Yucca Mountain game I designed, it's like I designed it so that it could be learned and played within a 50-minute recitation with absolutely like no advance notice or background material. You didn't have to know anything else, which was like its own challenge for game design. But like those were the resources I had. Like that's the situation it was, and that's where I had to meet my students. And so I think that's true of all levels of instruction, but certainly for gaming. Just on like one note, I realized that we actually forgot for our acknowledgements because as much as we loved working on this, we absolutely could not have done it with a bunch of great faculty support. So Chris Toomey at MPS was essential. Eric Higginbotham and Dick Samuels were teaching the wargaming course at MIT. And then Eric Lane Greenberg was our closest advisor during this. And he was the person who was like, hey, you guys should do a survey about this because you're doing a lot of work and it would like be great afterwards to be able to talk about it. And we're like, hey, that's a pretty good point. And so he really shepherded us through this, and especially through the publication process. So I just want to say that we're very grateful to those people.
How do we prepare other instructors to maybe think about what decisions they need to make in the moment? How do you are there rules for the white cell or for the instructors around like, obviously putting the objectives first, but how do you do that when you're making decisions about what pieces of these move forward, what changes need to be made? How are you what are the levers that can be pulled, and what are the ones that lead to just like, and after this turn, everything went really bad very quickly, and then now we don't have any more turns to play, right? Like, I think that would be a fear for a lot of people of like, oh, I've pushed it too far, and now like, we gotten to a point where we're not addressing the objectives anymore, right? So that was sort of the first question of like the very real practical piece of it. And then the second one is just from your experience sitting in that room as part of that group, was there something that sort of surprised you from a teaching and learning perspective of like, oh, this took a turn in these ways that we didn't expect, and now we've got to make a decision. Was there a specific example that you might give? And maybe not, I don't know.
Sure. I think maybe I'll start with the first question and hopefully leave the harder second question for Suzanne. I think for the first one, like there are two answers. There's like the good scholarly answer, which is like there are a ton of resources out there. Like ours is not the only paper on gaming and education. Lots of these places have all their supplementary materials up. You can dive into it. You can see what decisions were made. You can see what type of resources you need. There are even like free off-the-shelf games, I think, for a variety of younger audiences available to a lot of instructors. So there's a way to immerse yourself in it before doing it. I think the real answer is you sort of do have to just do it and then learn as it goes along, because gaming is, again, because of how fast-paced and flexible and how stuff comes up, you have to have experience doing it. And that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this game in the first place, is for our other MIT grad students to like have them be an experience, like playing in a game. And then also we had a lot of students be on the white cell and be like, okay, this is how decisions are made. This is how, if you want to run a game, this is like how crazy and chaotic it gets. And so I think that for a lot of instructors, sort of just, try it and like, yeah, sure. I mean, like any other method of instruction, you'll like mess up a bunch at the beginning, but unless your students are heartless, I feel like they'll probably realize you're trying your best.
And I think with a war game as well, students are often having fun, so they're a little bit more forgiving if everything isn't going exactly as you might have hoped. And they often don't quite realize if things haven't gone the way that you hoped. I think there are a lot of ways to simplify a game like this. So this game is particularly complex because it has 4 teams, and each of the teams have 2 halves, and it's run over such a long period of time, which we were very grateful for, right? Without, in a 50-minute recitation section, this would not be possible. But the fact that we had 2 days to play, you can play a much more complex game. But sort of as an example of what something sort of simpler might look like, is I know that there are off-the-shelf games that deal with, for example, the Middle East crisis between Israel and sort of Palestinians. And sort of this much more simple game is sort of you give students negotiator roles in an Israeli delegation and a Palestinian delegation, and then you have them come together and try to negotiate some deal. And so there's only 2 teams, there's one objective, and they're negotiating over a much shorter period of time. And there's not really very much for the instructor to have to adjudicate between. Maybe they'll have one meeting, you'll decide sort of a little bit of what happens, and then they'll come back together for another meeting. But there would be much less open decision space for the instructor during the game to have to sort of massage things, because it's a much more simple game, if that example helps. But I guess as an example of sort of how did we try and correct sort of during the game for the learning objectives, I think Ben spoke to this a little bit during the presentation, but we did have players on the China team who were very forward-leaning, and players on the US and Japan team who were a little bit more cautious. And I think one of the things that made the particular China players so much forward-leaning is that they really took this stance where they were saying that China needs to coordinate all humanitarian aid coming into Taiwan. And that became a very difficult thing for the US players and Japanese players to figure out how to get around. And one of the decisions that we ended up making in designing the game is we didn't put heads of states in the player cells, meaning that if they wanted to have a decision come from their head of state, they would have to ask the white cell, right? So, that helps, right? Because if they're trying to decide something or they want to do something sort of more out there, there's the ability for the white cell to kind of be like, well, your president says, or, like Chairman Xi this will not like fly, right? And I think that helps a little bit in sort of a design decision that we made.
I want to point out, so like just as a scalable example, right? Yeah. That building in those specific opportunities, right? Yeah. You referred to it as head of state. Maybe in some other areas, it's the judge on the case, or maybe in some other area, right? Like where you've got that sort of wiggle room to redirect in a way that doesn't leave it just to the people who are playing the game to have complete control over how to move it forward. Because I think that's the piece of a design choice that could get you in trouble when you're thinking about how the game can play out.
I think not having head of state was also good because it didn't create like a strong hierarchy within the cell, right? Because you do want all of your students to feel like they're on equal footing.
In an abstract sense, like one way to think about designing a game for education is, as Suzanne said, well, like you always start with your learning objectives. What are you trying to learn? And from there are certain things, like certain decisions you have to make and certain things you have to model. Like you have to figure out, okay, like what's my scenario in the first place? Like what is this going to be about? You have to figure out who your actors are going to be. Like who are your players actually going to represent? Who's going to be abstracted away? And then you have to think about the decision space. You have to think like, okay, what options am I giving my players? What things can they do? Then you have to think about like how long this is going to be. Is this going to be real time or like turn-based? And there are like all these sets of decisions that you make that should all be like flowing back from your learning objectives. And so like this is an example of like for most of our decisions, we picked the one that led to like the most chaos and work. Like we had a really important scenario with really big actors, and we had absolutely no constraints over the decisions they made, other than the slight like, well, your head of state isn't here, so like maybe think before you like decide to use nuclear weapons, right? Like, so we led that, but like if you are trying to design like a much more constrained scenario, like there's way different options to cut down on the potential adjudication space that you'll have as an instructor.
I think instructors also typically pick games that are within their area of knowledge, right? The other sort of key piece that makes sort of an instructor flexible in this is, right, we had faculty members working with us who were experts on Chinese politics, who were experts on Japanese politics, and sort of experts on the regional dynamics, right? So they already knew all of those things, and sort of it made it much easier to sort of pivot in different ways. And sort of if you were designing a game in your own course, you would sort of pick to have that game in an area that is really sort of your comparative advantage, what it is that you really understand. And I think that helps a lot in your ability to be flexible during the game. I would say that it is correct that there was more homework for us. So I think for this game that was in November, we started designing it in September. But I would say that like the initial lift for doing the first event was much higher than the lift at the next, right? Because once you've designed this game, then in the 3 other times that we've played it?
Three total, yeah.
3 total. Those next 2 iterations of the game were much less work, right? But that first time that you're doing the game, it's sort of multiple meetings over the months leading up to it and work outside of those meetings and sort of a group that you're working with. Whereas for the students, what we had is we had a recorded lecture by one of the faculty members sort of introducing the scenario. And then when they actually arrived for the first game day, they would be told what the crisis was. And sort of, I think it was maybe like a 15-minute video that they had to watch.
That, and I think they had some background materials specifically like on Taiwan and the special relationship and all that sort of stuff.
And I think that they were assigned their role before they arrived. So they were going to read about their role, watch this 15-minute video, and maybe read a couple of things.
So like the homework for players, it like theoretically it's just like the biggest thing for games is time. Everything's time intensive, and like for more complex games or for more moves, it just takes longer. And so homework is a way to like offload that time from the game beforehand. And so, it's great if you can assign the rules and stuff beforehand and get students to be somewhat familiar with that. But you also have to have trust in your students actually doing the work. Suzanne, so much of the work was on our end, and a lot of it was just administrative, because this was like a big white cell with a bunch of people and a big moving team. Like a lot of it was like, okay, how are we tracking what everyone's doing? How are we keeping track of this? How are we who's making all the Gmail accounts? Like who's going through the passwords? Who's making sure that players aren't locked out of them? Like who set up the Zoom architecture? Okay, we have to have hosts for every Zoom room for the entire duration of the game. Like we have a spreadsheet keeping track of that. Like where are all the passwords for everything here? Like what system is the white cell itself using to communicate? Like all these things that they just sort of add up, especially in the digital system. I think especially to contrast this with like a game that I've done, a recitation section for which there's like no homework, you're more limited in what you can do, but I don't think it's necessarily like more preparation time on my end than I'd necessarily do for like a normal recitation or discussion section where you're still trying to do things to keep the students engaged and you need to know the material. And also the game is fun for the students. Game design is also really fun for an instructor. It's really fun to get into the weeds and be thinking about this and making the materials and building all this stuff. And so I think weeks where I've been doing that have been easier to prepare than okay, we've had 10 readings this week. Let's make sure we go through all of them because a lot of them are really technical. And I know you guys didn't do it because it's April. So yeah, it's just a different type of lift.
I want to thank you both so much. Please, everyone. I think I speak for a lot of us in our group in saying this was exceptional. This is exceptional work, and the thinking you've done and are willing to share with the community is amazing. And I thank you very much for coming and sharing your work and the story. And looking forward to working with you guys on some ideas moving forward for sure.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, and thanks for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.